Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. We left Alvin and his friend Hilvar having discovered the ancient fortress of Shalmarain now being tended by a large aquatic polyp, which is telling them all about its former master. Chapter 13. The Master had come to Earth amidst the chaos of the transition centuries, when the galactic empire was crumbling, but the lines of communication among the stars had not yet completely broken. He had been of human origin, though his home was a planet circling one of the seven suns. While still a young man, he had been forced to leave his native world, and its memory had haunted him all his life. His expulsion he blamed on vindictive enemies. The Master, even if he was expelled from his own world, did not leave it unprovided. The seven suns had been the center of galactic power and science, and he must have possessed influential friends. He had made his Hegira in a small but speedy ship reputed to be one of the fastest ever built. With him into exile, he had taken another of the ultimate products of galactic science, the robot, which was looking at Alvin and Hilvar even now. No one had ever known the full talents and functioning of this machine. To some extent, indeed, it had become the Master's alter ego. Without it, his religion of the Great Ones would probably have collapsed after his death. Together they had roved among the star clouds on a zigzag trail which led at last, certainly not by accident, back to the world from which the Master's ancestors had sprung. Entire libraries had been written about that saga, each work therein inspiring a host of commentaries, until, by a kind of chain reaction, the original volumes were lost beneath mountains of exegesis and annotation. The Master had stopped at many worlds and made disciples among many races. His personality must have been an immensely powerful one for it to have inspired humans and non-humans alike, and there was no doubt that a religion such as his, of such wide appeal, must have contained much that was fine and noble. Probably the Master was the most successful, as he was also the last, of all mankind's prophets. None of his predecessors could have won so many converts, nor had their teachings carried across such gulfs of time and space. What those teachings were, neither Alvin nor Hilvar could ever discover with any accuracy. The great polyp did its best to convey them, but many of the words it used were meaningless, and it had a habit of repeating sentences or whole speeches with a kind of swift mechanical delivery which made them very hard to follow. After a while, Hilvar did his best to steer the conversation away from these meaningless morasses of theology in order to concentrate on ascertainable facts. The Master and a band of his most faithful followers had arrived on Earth in the days before the cities had passed away, and while Port of Diaspar was still open to the stars. They must have come in ships of many kinds. The polyps, for example, in one filled with water of the sea which was their natural home. Whether the movement was well received on Earth was not certain, but at least it met no violent opposition, and after further wanderings it set up its final retreat among the forests and mountains of Lys. At the close of his long life, the Master's thoughts had turned once more toward the home from which he had been exiled, and he had asked his friends to carry him out into the open so he could watch the stars. He had waited, his strength waning, until the culmination of the seven suns, and toward the end he babbled many things which were to inspire yet more libraries of interpretation in future ages. Again and again he spoke of the great ones who had now left this universe of space and matter, but who would surely one day return, and he charged his followers to remain to greet them when they came. Those were his last rational words. He was never again conscious of his surroundings. But just before the end he uttered one phrase that had come down the ages to haunt the minds of all who heard it. It is lovely to watch the colored shadows on the planets of eternal light. Then he died. At the Master's death, many of his followers broke away, but others remained faithful to his teachings, which they slowly elaborated through the ages. At first, they believed that the Great Ones, whoever they were, would soon return, but that hope faded with the passing centuries. The story here grew very confused, and it seemed that truth and legend were inextricably intertwined. Alvin had only a vague picture of generations of fanatics waiting for some great event which they did not understand to take place at some unknown future date. The Great Ones never returned. Slowly, the power of the movement failed as death and disillusion robbed it of its disciples. The short-lived human followers were the first to go, and there was something supremely ironic in the fact that the very last adherent of a human prophet was a creature utterly unlike man. The great polyp had become the Master's last disciple for a very simple reason. It was immortal. The billions of individual cells from which its body was built up would die, but before that happened, they would have reproduced themselves. At long intervals, the monster would disintegrate into its myriad separate cells, which would go their own way and multiply by fission if their environment was suitable. During this phase, the polyp did not exist as a self-conscious intelligent entity, and here Alvin was irresistibly reminded of the manner in which the inhabitants of Diaspar spent their quiescent millennia in the city's memory banks. In due time, some mysterious biological force brought the scattered components together again, and the polyp began a new cycle of existence. It returned to awareness and recollection of its earlier lives, though often imperfectly, as accidents sometimes damaged the cells which carried the delicate patterns of memory. Perhaps no other form of life could have kept faith so long to a creed otherwise forgotten for 1,000 million years. In a sense, the great polyp was a helpless victim of its biological nature. Because of its immortality, it could not change, but was forced to repeat eternally the same invariant pattern. The religion of the Great Ones, in its later stages, had become identified with the veneration of the seven suns. When the Great Ones stubbornly refused to appear, attempts were made to signal their distant home. Long ago, the signaling had become no more than a meaningless ritual, now maintained by an animal which had forgotten how to learn, and a robot which had never known how to forget. As the immeasurably ancient voice died away into the still air, Alvin found himself overwhelmed by a surge of pity. The misplaced devotion, the loyalty that had held it to its futile course while suns and planets passed away. He could never have believed such a tale had he not seen the evidence before his eyes. More than that, before the extent of his ignorance saddened him. A tiny fragment of the past had been illuminated for a little while, but now the darkness had closed over it again. The history of the universe must be a mass of such disconnected threads, and no one could say which were important and which were trivial. This fantastic tale of the Master and the Great Ones seemed like another of the countless legends that had somehow survived from the civilizations of the dawn. Yet the very existence of the huge polyp and of the silently watching robot made it impossible for Alvin to dismiss the whole story as a fabric built on self-delusion upon a foundation of madness. What was the relationship, he wondered, between these two entities, which, though so very different in every possible way, had maintained their extraordinary partnership over such eons of time? He was somehow certain that the robot was much the more important of the two. It had been the confidant of the Master and must still know all his secrets. Alvin looked at the enigmatic machine that still regarded him steadily. Why would it not speak? What thoughts were passing through its complicated and perhaps alien mind? Yet surely, if it had been designed to serve the Master, its mind would not be altogether alien, and it should respond to human orders. As he thought of all the secrets which that stubbornly mute machine possessed, Alvin felt a curiosity so great it verged upon greed. It seemed unfair for such knowledge to be so wasted and hidden from the world. Here must lie wonders beyond the ken even of the central computer in Diaspar. "Why won't your robot speak to us?" he asked the polyp when Hilvar had momentarily run out of questions. The answer was one he had half expected. "It was against the master's wishes for it to speak with any voice but his, and his voice is silent now." "But it will obey you?" "Yes. The master placed it in our charge. We can see through its eyes wherever it goes. It watches over the machines which preserve this lake and keep its water pure. Yet it would be truer to call it our partner than our servant." Alvin thought this over. An idea, still vague and half-formed, was beginning to take shape in his mind. Perhaps it was inspired by pure lust for knowledge and power. When he looked back on this moment, he could never be certain just what his motives were. They might be largely selfish, but they also contained some element of compassion. If he could do so, he would like to break this futile sequence and release these creatures from their fantastic fate. He was not sure what could be done about the polyp, but it might be possible to cure the robot of his insanity, and at the same time to release its priceless pent-up memories. "Are you certain," he said slowly, talking to the polyp but aiming his words at the robot, "that you are really carrying out the master's wishes by remaining here? He desired the world to know his teachings, but they have been lost while you hide here in Shalmarain. It was only by chance that we discovered you, and there may be others who would like to hear the doctrine of the Great Ones." Hilvar glanced at him sharply, obviously uncertain of his intentions. The polyp seemed agitated, and the steady beating of its respiratory equipment faltered for a few seconds. Then it replied in a voice not altogether under control, "We have discussed this problem for many years, but we cannot leave Shalmarain, so the world must come to us no matter how long it takes." "I have a better idea," said Alvin eagerly. "It is true that you may have to stay here in the lake, but there's no reason why your companion should not come with us. He can return whenever he wishes or whenever you need him. Many things have changed since the master died, things which you should know about, but which you can never understand if you stay here." The robot never moved, but in its agony of indecision, the polyp sank completely below the surface of the lake and remained there for several minutes. Perhaps it was having a soundless argument with its colleague. Several times it began to re-emerge, thought better of it, and sank into the water again. Hilvar took this opportunity to exchange a few words with Alvin. "I'd like to know what you're trying to do," he said softly, his voice half bantering, half serious. "Or don't you know yourself?" "Surely," replied Alvin, "you feel sorry for these poor creatures. Don't you think it would be a kindness to rescue them?" "I do, but I've learned enough about you to be fairly certain that altruism isn't one of your dominant emotions. You must have some other motive." Alvin smiled ruefully. Even if Hilvar did not read his mind, and he had no reason to suppose that he did, he could undoubtedly read his character. "Well, your people have remarkable mental powers," he replied, trying to divert the conversation from dangerous ground. "I think they might be able to do something for the robot, if not for this animal." He spoke very softly, lest he be overheard. The precaution might have been a useless one, but if the robot did intercept his remarks, it gave no sign of it. Fortunately, before Hilvar could press the inquiry any further, the polyp emerged once more from the lake. In the last few minutes, it had become a good deal smaller, and its movements were more disorganized. Even as Alvin watched, a segment of its complex, translucent body broke away from the main bulk and then disintegrated into multitudes of smaller sections, which swiftly disappeared. The creature was beginning to break up before their eyes. Its voice, when it spoke again, was very erratic and hard to understand. "Next cycle's starting," it jerked out in a kind of fluctuating whisper. "Did not expect it so soon. Only a few minutes left. Stimulation too great. Cannot hold together much longer." Alvin and Hilvar stared at the creature in horrified fascination. Even though the process they were watching was a natural one, it was not pleasant to watch an intelligent creature apparently in its death throes. They also felt an obscure sense of guilt. It was irrational to have the feeling, since it was of no great importance when the polyp began another cycle, but they realized that the unusual effort and excitement caused by their presence was responsible for this premature metamorphosis. Alvin realized that he would have to act quickly or his opportunity would be gone, perhaps only for a few years, perhaps for centuries. "What have you decided?" he said eagerly. "Is the robot coming with us?" There was an agonizing pause while the polyp tried to force its dissolving body to obey its will. The speech diaphragm fluttered, but no audible sound came from it. Then, as if in a despairing gesture of farewell, it waved its delicate palps feebly and let them fall back into the water, where they promptly broke adrift and went floating out into the lake. In a matter of minutes, the transformation was over. Nothing of the creature larger than an inch across remained. The water was full of tiny greenish specks which seemed to have a life and mobility of their own, and which rapidly disappeared into the vastness of the lake. The ripples on the surface had now altogether died away, and Alvin knew that the steady pulse beat that had sounded into the depths would now be stilled. The lake was dead again, or so it seemed. But that was an illusion. One day the unknown forces that had never failed to do their duty in the past would exert themselves again, and the polyp would be reborn. It was a strange and wonderful phenomenon. Yet was it so much stranger than the organization of the human body, itself a vast colony of separate living cells? Alvin wasted little effort on such speculation. He was oppressed by his sense of failure, even though he had never clearly conceived the goal he was aiming for. A dazzling opportunity had been missed, and he might never again return. He stared sadly out across the lake, and it was some time before his mind registered the message which Hilvar was speaking quietly in his ear. "Alvin," his friend said softly, "I think you have won your point." He spun swiftly on his heels. The robot, which until now had been floating aloofly in the distance, never approaching within 20 feet of them, had moved up in silence and was now poised a yard above his head. Its unmoving eyes, with their wide-angle vision, gave no indication of its direction of interest. Probably it saw the entire hemisphere in front of it with equal clarity, but Alvin had little doubt that its attention was now focused on him. It was waiting for his next move. To some extent, at least, it was now under his control. It might follow him to Lys, perhaps even to Diaspar, unless it changed its mind. Until then, he was its probationary master. Chapter 14. The journey back to Airlie lasted almost 3 days, partly because Alvin, for his own reasons, was in no hurry to return. The physical exploration of Lys had now taken second place to a more important and exciting project, and he was slowly making contact with a strange, obsessed intelligence which had now become his companion. He suspected that the robot was trying to use him for its own purposes, which would be no more than poetic justice. What its motives were, he could never be quite certain, since it still stubbornly refused to speak to him. For some reason of his own, perhaps fear that it might reveal too many of his secrets, the master must have placed very efficient blocks upon its speech circuits, and Alvin's attempt to clear them were completely unsuccessful. Even indirect questioning of the "if you say nothing, I shall assume you mean yes" type failed. The robot was much too intelligent to be taken in by such simple tricks. In other respects, however, it was more cooperative. It would obey orders which did not require it to speak or reveal information. After a while, Alvin found that he could control it, as he could direct the robots in Diaspar by thought alone. This was a great step forward, and a little later, The creature, it was hard to think of it as a mere machine, relaxed its guard still further and allowed him to see through its eyes. It did not object, it seemed, to such passive forms of communication, but it blocked all attempts at closer intimacy. Hilvar's existence it ignored completely. It would obey none of his commands, and its mind was closed to all his probing. At first this was something of a disappointment to Alvin, who had hoped that Hilvar's greater mental powers would enable him to force open this treasure chest of hidden memories. It was not until later that he realized the advantage of possessing a servant who would obey no one else in the world. The member of the expedition who strongly objected to the robot was Criff. Perhaps he imagined that he now had a rival, or perhaps he disapproved on general principles of anything that flew without wings. When no one was looking, he made several direct assaults on the robot, which had infuriated him still further by not taking the slightest notice of his attacks. Eventually, Hilvar had been able to calm him down, and on the homeward journey in the ground car he seemed to have resigned himself to the situation. Robot and insect escorted the vehicle as it glided silently through forest and field, each keeping to the side of its respective master and pretending that the rival was not there. So, we have a boy and his bot and a boy and his bug, and they are headed towards the home of one of them, and life is about to become very complicated. More next time.